Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Adam Smith's Panmure House. And welcome to those that are watching the live stream and to those that will watch the video here on after in perpetuity, I hope, because we have a great speaker this evening. For those of you that have been here before, you will have heard this story many times, but for those that don't know much about Panmure House, I'd like to say a few words about it. The house was originally built in 1691 as the town seat of the Earl of Panmure, hence its name. But why are we here today in the 21st century? Well, because it was the home of Adam Smith, one of the most important, at least Scottish moral philosophers, but I would say one of the most important thinkers of the last 300 years. Smith lived here between 1778 and 1790. And while here, he completed or made major revisions on his two great masterworks, The Wealth of Nations and The Theory of Moral Sentiments. During the 12 years that Smith was here, the house was a hub of intellectual enlightenment and discussion about all the big issues of the day, just like what we want to do now in the 21st century. Edinburgh Business School and Heriot-Watt University rescued the house in 2008 and spent a decade and £5.6 million restoring it to its 18th century standard. And now once again, we are reviving the intellectual spirit of Adam Smith to create a new home of economic and social debate and research here in Edinburgh, but for the world. Panmure House programs like the one this evening, the Adam Smith Lecture Series, are designed to engage us with the big issues that we face today. They're also designed to engage us with the legacy of Adam Smith in a tangible way. Smith was a broad thinker. He was an interdisciplinarian by default, like many of his contemporaries. They worked across topics and fields, and they read widely. To that end, I'd like to share one of our more recent projects, and that's restoring part of Adam Smith's library, or at least getting books that were here. When Smith lived here, he had over 3,000 titles. A lot of books for the late 18th century. That just shows you the depth and the breadth of this person and this thinker. We know what books Smith had. Many of them are in, or half of them are in the University of Edinburgh Library, a large number also in Japan, and then private collections elsewhere. But we know what those titles are. And from 3,000, we have selected 200 books, and we are in the process of restoring that library. And just to give you an idea of the types of topics that Smith was interested in, and why am I telling you this is because people think of Smith as simply an economist, but actually he was much, much more than that. He had books that included drama and the arts, sciences, or as they said at the time, natural philosophy, classical philosophy, history, and nature, amongst many others. So for example, he had James Cook's voyages, the diaries on his voyages to the South Pole and to the Pacific. He had a really interesting book by William Dixon, who was, no, it spelled differently than my surname, called The Letters of Slavery. And William Dixon was a prominent abolitionist of the period. He has the complete works, or had the complete works of William Shakespeare, Voltaire. He had books from Montesquieu, David Hume, of course, Puffendorf, Virgil. To say the least, there was much to be said about Adam Smith's breadth of his intellect, and from that, the spirit of the Enlightenment which we seek to rekindle for the 21st century. And now to our speaker for this evening, which has been made possible by the generous support of one of our sponsors, Bailey Gifford. We're thrilled to welcome, as our speaker this evening, Branko Milanovic. Branko is currently research professor at the Graduate Center at the City University of New York and a senior scholar at the Stone Center on Socioeconomic Inequality. He served as a lead economist in the World Bank's research department for almost 20 years, leaving to write his book on global inequality, Worlds Apart, which was published in 2005. Branko's main area of work includes income inequality in individual countries and globally, and as well, historically, looking at pre-industrial societies. His book, The Haves and the Have-Nots of 2011, was selected by The Globalist as the 2011 Book of the Year. His book, Global Inequality, in 2016 was awarded the Bruno Kreisky Prize for the Best Political Book of 2016 and the Hans Mauthofer Prize in 2018. In 2019, he published Capitalism Alone, The Future of the System That Rules the World. His new book, which is for purchase downstairs, and I encourage you all to purchase it. I've read it. I was fortunate. I saw Branko in DC in September, and he had just got the box of the new books, and he brought it along and signed it for me, and so it says Adam, and so I feel very special. I'm holding on to that because it's going to be worth something at some point. But please do look at his book. But his topic will be slightly different this evening. Branko, please, welcome.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you so much for the introduction and for the invitation. I honestly have problems actually thinking what would be a greater honor for an economist than to speak in the house of Adam Smith, because it was he was obviously, as we all know, the founder of the science that we believe is a science and that we work on. And being in his house and somehow being obviously able to sort of get the spirit under which he lived and labored is obviously a very unique opportunity. Now, as Adam said, of course, my work is mostly on inequality. I was attracted to Adam Smith many years ago when I was a young man, and recently I decided to write the book that Adam kindly mentioned called Visions of Inequality, which looks at how 6 very important economists, starting with Francois Quesnay, continuing with Adam Smith, then David Ricardo, Karl Marx, Wilfredo Pareto, and Simon Kuznets, thought about income distribution. So I have a very specific interest in interpreting how I think Adam Smith saw the question of income distribution, not from the normative point of view, which of course other people have written, but really from the point of view how the factor shares, meaning rent from land, profit from capital, and wages from labor, would change or evolve in an advancing society. So that's actually the point of the chapter in the book. I've decided for this lecture actually to go a little bit further than what I have in the book. So the lecture itself is, it's a self-standing discourse on what I think are important features in Adam Smith. So let me start with I would like to actually begin by highlighting 3 features of individuals in society that I think are important or believed, or important in Adam Smith's work or believed by him. So let me go. The first one, I actually had problem choosing the exact word in English, was a belief in sameness of people. When I mean sameness, doesn't mean identity, nor does it mean similarity, because these 2 things are different from sameness. What I meant sameness was the ability first to understand each other's motivations, which plays, as we know, such a big role in empathy and sympathy in the theory of moral sentiments, but also sameness in the ability to understand self-interest, or what sometimes Adam Smith calls self-love, which is then the foundational principle of the wealth of nations. So really, in both cases, it is our ability to interpret others' interest or desires that is crucial. If it exists, then obviously we have what I actually called the sameness of people. The second point is that I believe that for Adam Smith, the accidents in life, which includes place of birth and parental background play a very significant role. Some of you, of course, remember his statement that the difference between a philosopher and a beggar is very little, fundamentally, and at an early age. And I think it's an important feature because it has direct implication on how you can interpret Smith in terms of his views about income distribution. Because if there is a sameness of people, then every departure from equality, in some sense, has to be justified. And a large part of inequality, of which I will talk maybe later, comes from the difference in what more sort of modern terminology by John Romer calls difference in circumstances. So they are very important. And I would like to point out that these two things, sameness of people and the differences in circumstances, then lead to inequality, which we observe, but that inequality does not mean fundamental inequality between people. We can observe much higher inequality than in truth exists between people. And my third point is about, and I think it's an important point, is about skepticism that Adam Smith entertains towards any organized associations. And I have in mind 4 types of associations that are explicitly criticized in many places in Wealth of Nations. They are the organizations of government, because it is a group of people, organized religion, trade unions, and employers or masters associations. And I would, of course, focus a lot on this last point because I think it's one that is very much overlooked. I think that when we interpret, and the common interpretation of Smith is that his criticism is mostly directed against that one group, which is called the government. I think when you read the number of references in the Wealth of Nations, which are extremely critical about employers' associations and employers getting together either to deceive the public or to establish monopoly, I think these references are much more frequent, and as I would actually try to explain, I believe they derive from his position regarding the evolution of the income shares. Now, let me just make one personal reflection here. When I actually was invited very kindly by Adam to come and give this lecture, I thought I asked myself the following question. What would have Adam Smith thought of somebody coming from Serbia to give a lecture in his house 250 years after his death? And I actually thought, it was, I think, an interesting question per se. And I thought that he would not be surprised. And I gave 2 reasons why. The first one I already gave you because of his fundamental belief in sameness of people. If you have this fundamental belief, then basically, as I was saying before, all people are the same. So you cannot be surprised that with the outcomes, because the outcomes are simply very often just a result of the circumstances which are favorable or unfavorable. But the second part I think is also important, and it's his belief in growth. And why growth is important is because what he observed during his lifetime in Scotland. And I actually even think there would be no Adam Smith without Scottish economic development. Because what he observed was Scotland was a vibrant society, very progressive, that actually became much richer during his own lifetime. And he observed that it went together, was made possible by greater education and better health, but also implied better education and better health. Consequently, economic growth was the engine of what you can call, if we call, betterment. Now, that engine of betterment also implies ability to reflect on one's past and the present. And then talking of the past, when I asked this question myself, I did actually recalculation in my mind. I asked the following question. How many of my relatives, I cannot really figure it out, particularly from my father's side, that far to 1776 when the Wealth of Nations was published, were actually literate. And you know, the numbers come pretty big, because you put 2 on the 8th degree is a pretty big number. And I don't think, I'm actually guessing, but probably the number was, you know, 5 or 6 out of 200, whatever, 56 people. So the development and growth makes it possible for people who otherwise illiterate could not express themselves. And illiterate people are not stupider than we are. It's just that they don't have the means of expression. And the means of expression come from economic growth and from literacy. So that's why I thought actually was an argument, an additional argument, that Adam Smith would not have been surprised, because he would have expected growth to produce exactly what it did. Maybe not in sufficient numbers, maybe it should have been better, but it did produce that ability, self-awareness, and ability to express that self-awareness. So this was simply the sort of a personal comment. But let me then continue with the 3 essential points. I think one that I already mentioned, well, actually I mentioned all 3 of them, but I think I discussed the sameness quite a lot. And I think it is in the basis of, as I mentioned, in both theory of moral sentiments and the wealth of nations in 2 different forms. Because without people being the same, we could not feel empathy with others, simply because we could never mentally place ourselves in their position. And without people being the same, we could never understand self-interest as the engine of economic activity, nor figure out why other people's interests and ours may be complementary, as in the famous lines in The Wealth of Nations about the butcher and the brewer and the baker and ourselves. It actually really requires our ability to understand them. And we are able to understand them because we are actually, to some extent, them, because our interests are not only complementary, but we are able to understand their interests because we have the same interests vis-a-vis them that they have vis-a-vis us. Just a quote, an augmentation of fortune is the means by which the greater part of men propose and wish to better their condition. This seems like a straightforward statement, but it requires an ability to understand that also the others want what we want, which is a betterment of our condition. Now, the second principle, as I said, is the importance of social conditions under which men and women are born and under which we live compared to our observable success. In other words, if accidents of birth play a very important role, as I said before, then inherent differences between people cannot be large. In other words, what we observe as difference in income is much greater than the inherent difference in us or in our ability. And if it is the case, then it also means, as I was saying, that departure from equality have to be justified, and that we are often led to ascribe much greater difference to inherent qualities simply by observing differences in income and wealth than they deserve. In other words, the inherent differences are much less because lots of observed differences produced by the circumstances, which means circumstances mostly of family background and birth. And as I already said, that the difference between a porter and a philosopher in the first 4 or 5 years of their life is, properly speaking, none at all. That was from the lectures on, that was actually from the lectures on jurisprudence, I believe, yes. But it's also expressed, the same idea is expressed in the theory of moral sentiments. Now, I come to the third point, which I actually think is important, and this is the point about the associations, skeptical view about all associations. I mentioned 4 associations. I would actually, I would say that he is the least critical about the associations of working people. And the reason he is least critical about the association of working people is, I think, threefold. First, the objective of government policy, as Adam Smith says, is opulence of the most numerous group of people. As he says, it is only fair that those who feed and clothe us should be also fed and clothed. So the objective of the policy is really the opulence or welfare, as we would say today, of that large group. Secondly, he thought that workers' associations have little influence on government policy because of low education of workers. And third one, he thought that combinations of workers are very difficult to make simply because there are many of them as opposed to the employers. So the one that I believe was least critical was the associations of workers, of which later became trade union. As he says, what improves the circumstances of the greater part can never be regarded as an inconvenience to the whole, which obviously means that what improves the circumstances of workers cannot be seen as inconvenience for the whole. And no society can be flourishing and happy of which the far greater part of the members are poor and miserable. Now, the second association that is often considered that the group as the association of which Adam Smith was most critical is the government. Now, I am not denying, and actually there are many quotes. I would just give you one, a little bit lengthy, on the critical quotes of government. But I don't think that we should single out, as is often done, the critique of the government as being the key part of Adam Smith. Actually, he's criticizing all four of them, and I would actually argue in a minute, he's criticizing the employers' associations more than the government. Now, as for the government, as you know, that was this, I think, famous quote, "It is the highest impertinence and presumption in kings and ministers to pretend to watch over the economy of private people and to restrain their expense, either by sumptuary laws or by prohibiting the importation of foreign luxuries. They are themselves always and without any exception the greatest spendthrifts in society. And if their own extravagance does not ruin the state, that of their subjects never will." So it's a very clear attack on the government. It's a very clear attack, especially on many of the petty and some greater inconveniences that the governments put in the way of private activity. It is also critique of government people paying themselves high salaries. As he says, the emolument of offices are not regulated by the free competition and do not therefore bear a just proportion to what the nature of the employment, state employment, requires. They are, in most countries, higher than it requires, the person who have administration of government being generally disposed to reward themselves and their immediate dependents rather more than enough. So that was for the government. But let me just simply say that when it comes to organizations, he is also very critical of organized religion. And it is a very interesting statement where he says that in two very important aspects, food, basically food and corn, and as it was called in English, corn and wheat, and religion, governments have to play according to the popular prejudice. And consequently, he says, neither laws on corn nor laws on religion actually reflect what they should, except popular prejudice. So he sees, it's a very interesting statement where actually he sees really the government role in religion as being, how should I say, just essentially following the popular prejudice. And coming also to organized religion, there is a quite a well-known statement when he says that the Quakers who have released their slaves probably released them because there were very few of them, of slaves. A very ironic statement about the importance and power of organized religion. But I would come to the last point, and which is the criticism of the association of capitalists. Now, that critique, I think, is very common. You know, the famous quotes again, people of the same trade seldom meet together even for merriment and diversion, but the conversation ends in a conspiracy against the public. But though the law cannot hinder people of the same trade from sometimes assembling together, it ought to do nothing to facilitate such assemblies, much less to render them necessary. And of course, at the time of Davos and of the Renaissance weekends and other things, one is actually one becomes reflects on that, because the situation now is not only the government make this possible and facilitate it, they are very eager to participate. And so that was the significant change, and something that I think, based on this, Adam Smith would not approve. Then he says the masters, being fewer in numbers, can combine much more easily, and the law besides authorizes, or at least does not prohibit their combinations, which in those days, as you know, the workers' combinations were illegal. They were banned. So why the employers have this advantage? And that's important part, I think. First, because they are few in numbers, so they can coordinate much better. Secondly, because he says they are actually very good in handling sophistry, unlike workers who are uneducated and landlords who Adam Smith says are indolent. Capitalists or masters are very good in handling sophistry, and they have a strong influence on the government. And the point, which I think was not noticed before, is the evolution of the factor shares. Now, let me say that this is actually, I think, a new point, and it goes as follows. But it is, of course, present, in my opinion. It's very strongly present in Adam Smith. In an advanced society, when he's asked how would factor shares change, the answer is the following. Wages would go up in an advanced society because the societies with higher productivity and richer do actually permit people to have higher real wage. And even they permit people to have allow people rather, to have higher minimal income, as in a famous statement where he says that, of course, poverty is relative, that if you feel ashamed of coming out in public in a shirt that is, not cotton shirt, then obviously the wealth of society dictates what should be the minimal poverty level and also dictates the wage. So the wages, to cut long story short, the wages would go up with an advanced commercial society. What will happen to the land rent? Adam Smith there says it would go up as well, because there is a greater demand for food, there are more people, and there is also greater demand for things like cotton and for the mining products. So land would become more valuable, and the owners of land, who are the landlords, would become richer. But what is the situation with profit? And of course, it's interesting because the same story would be to some extent repeated in Ricardo and then in Marx. Profits are expected to go down as society advances, because more of stock, as Adam Smith calls capital, more stock has been accumulated. They would compete with each other, and they would drive profit rate down. Now, what is the implication on the link between that statement and the statement that I said about critical attitude towards combinations of employers? Is because he says they are the only class whose interest is opposed to the general interest. And it's opposed to the general interest because the advancement of society would make them worse off. And they are the most likely to influence government policy for the reasons that I just mentioned before, education and sophistry. So one should be the most careful about them. And then he says, and I would actually finish with that, when he says every proposal that comes from that, the proposal of any new law of regulation which comes from this order ought always to be listened to with great precaution, and ought never to be adopted till after having been long and carefully examined, not only with the most scrupulous, but, this is important, with the most suspicious attention. And I think it comes precisely from that argument of the likelihood of evolution of different factor shares. And then he says, they are an order of men whose interest is never exactly the same with that of the public. And the reason for that is because the public interest to some extent is the interest of majority. And the interest of a majority are wage earners. And they who have generally an interest to deceive and even to oppress the public, and who have accordingly, upon many occasions, both deceived and oppressed it. So these are, and actually I have more here, so you can read that. And some of that even more damning than the ones that I gave now. So this is, I think, in my opinion, the reason why he believed he had a very skeptical attitude towards all kinds of organizations that pretend to promote public interest, but in reality promote particular interests. But he did not have an equally negative view about all four of them that I mentioned before. So the point of this talk is to maybe sort of shift a little bit the attention and the blame. The attention and the blame that was apparently Adam Smith was directed, according to the Chicago School, very strongly against the government. I will not deny that. Actually, it's very difficult to deny because there are statements in the Wealth of Nations, in particular, that are very negative for the government. But I think that the group against whom Adam Smith was most suspicious was not the government, was the Association of the Employers. And if we read the Wealth of Nations in particular as such, we can actually think, and I believe that it is not a wrong interpretation, that Adam Smith was the man of the left. That Smith was not the man of the right, but of the left. So this would be, I think, maybe the good point to stop. Thank you very much.
Well, so that leaves us on a controversial but actually quite useful starting point, because Smith is indeed thought of in many circles as a free market libertarian, but as you mentioned, he's been mobilized specifically by the libertarian side against government, and less so against the employers. And your view of him is that actually, no, he's much more of a social democrat, if you like.
I would say even further, actually, there are some, if you don't tell somebody where it comes from, and you just read that, people in the US would say that's Bernie Sanders. Yeah. And there are such critical comments, which doesn't mean, actually, I would agree with you totally that he was, and I was saying before, that he's man of free trade, including, of course, internal free trade, low regulation, and partisan of growth. But I think what has happened, unfortunately, on the left side, and maybe I'm just of this parallel leftist, the new, broadly speaking, the new left, and the interpretation, for example, that Amartya Sen gives of the theory of moral sentiments, is that the left somehow, that to be on the left, you have to question growth. And when people say, well, we question growth, and Adam Smith doesn't question growth, on the contrary, Adam Smith is in favor of growth, somehow he becomes the man of the right. But I think in his critique of the employers, he is very much, I think, man of the left. It's simply that the left, in my opinion, of the 19th century is very different from the left of the 21st century because of the growth element, particularly the growth element.
But would you not say that Smith, nonetheless, is not a statist, if you like?
No, he is not a statist. I would totally agree. He is not a statist because he actually is very negative about the role of the state and the government when it impedes the private business. And there, of course, I think it's also important to realize, am I not being... Okay, and I think it's also important. Oh, that's my microphone doing all this noise.
Yeah, I was wondering too.
I thought it was actually somebody moving chairs
Yeah.
over there. Sorry for that. But that's why I think actually his relationship to the physiocrats is also important, because physiocrats were, of course, for free international trade, but they were also especially for free domestic trade. And that also another aspect which is interesting in Adam Smith, when he talks also about the freedom of individuals to move within England and Scotland at that time, which was also limited. It's a little bit like hooker system in today's China. He was against that. He was for the free movement of people, free movement of goods, free movement, obviously, sale of services, and movement of technology. So yes, he was in favor of that, and he was very skeptical of the government.
So before we open up the floor to questions, I'm wondering if you could bring Smith to the 21st century, based on what you've said, where he's not a statist, but he's not a social democrat of the like of a large welfare state. He still is a liberal in the sense of freeing individuals from domination, whether that's from employers or other. What can we learn from Smith for the 21st century? And in particular, because you're an expert and on inequality, what can we learn from Smith in terms of our current challenges around wealth and income inequality, income inequality within countries, but also globally? That's a lot of
Lots of questions, so let me try to choose. I will just pick and choose. I think actually, first, of course, things have changed. For example, when I explained why I think that Smith is the least critical of trade unions, I gave the reasons that, difficulty of combination, then the low influence on government policy and so on. That has changed. Obviously, the trade unions had become, in the second part of the 20th century, much bigger players than they were in Adam Smith times. So maybe he would have consequently been more critical of them because of their ability to influence government policy than he was before. So if one were to actually sort of try to select, I would say maybe that he will be the closest, as you said before, to a social democratic vision of the world.
So you think he would be a social democrat?
I think there are some passages, as I said, which would actually look more like even more left-wing than social democratic. But the fact that social democrats are basically in favor of the essential features of a commercial society, which means that the government should be an important player but should not be an inhibitor of economic activity, would actually make Adam Smith, I think, agree with that. So I would still, as I said before, as I ended this talk, I think he will be man of the left. I'm not sure exactly on that spectrum where he would put him, because maybe in that case our interpretation, I said this in relationship to trade unions, our interpretation has to jump to the present. In other words, that greater role of the trade unions now would have come under greater scrutiny by Adam Smith. If their role was limited, he was less likely to negatively look at them than he might have done today.
Okay.
So does it sort of, it makes him social democrat with a somewhat skeptical view toward any association, including workers' association.
Yes.
But that would be the translation to today. It's not something that we can actually see in writing there.
Right.
No.
Okay, so we'll open the floor to questions. We'll have a microphone going around. Someone be courageous.
Oh, now we
So
have three
go with
already.
first James and then Susan.
Thank you. So that was particularly fascinating. But could I ask you a bit more about the rate of profit and where we've got to in today's terms and that? Plainly, the rate of profit in developed societies, and above all in America, is way higher than his basic concept would have that. How far do you think that's explained by his suspicion of the powers of the corporate sector, and how far is it other factors? I just think it's one of those intriguing ones where his predictions have not held up at all.
Well, it is a very difficult question. Let me say his predictions did not hold there, but they had a huge influence on, as you know, on the development of economics afterwards. Because everybody, I mentioned Ricardo and Marx. Ricardo, as we know, wrote the whole principles because of the fear that the profit rate would go down to zero because all the net income would be eaten up by rent. Marx, a very important part of Marx, possibly one of the 2 or 3 most important, is the tendency of the profit to fall. Afterwards, it became actually in Jevons as well. It was simply the diminishing marginal productivity of capital without technological change. So we have had always this fear of the profit rate going down. Schumpeter wrote Capitalism, Democracy, Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy because he believed that the profit rate would go down. And of course, when the profit rate is down, one has to realize that's the end of capitalism because nobody is going to invest for nothing. It's like saying, why should workers work for zero? Capitalists will not work for zero. And so that is true that actually didn't happen. And obviously now we are, what I understand, this is not something that I directly work on, but the profit rates are very high. And they have even increased. And they have increased even in the most recent period, which is not a particularly good period overall. So it could be, the argument has been made for income inequality studies, that the weakening in the most recent part of the trade unions, which is the result of a very different type of labor that people do now compared to 20 or 30 years ago, has contributed, that was actually Solo's point of view, that the bargaining position of labor has weakened, the bargaining position of capitalists has improved, consequently the profit rate is higher. So Solo's point, with the way I understand it, is essentially you have a net income, and that net income is only partially decided by the marginal productivity. The large chunk of that is the result of bargaining. And that would be how I would see the sort of the current evolution or the current level of the profit rate. So yes, you are right. Actually, it did not actually to some extent, luckily, it didn't come to that we would have a zero growth, because of course, if there is a zero profit, there is also zero investment. If there is zero investment, there is zero growth. So we are really in what Adam Smith calls stationary economy, whose condition, that's actually a nice term, he actually explains how the condition of people varies. He says in stationary economy, the condition is dull. In a declining economy, it's melancholic.
So Susan had her hand up, and then we'll...
Thank you for a really enlightening talk. I'm fascinated by which bits of Adam Smith's work are remembered and which aren't. And you mentioned employers being few in number, and they're very good at handling their own self-history. And I wondered if you thought that had played an influence in why some of Smith's more right-wing libertarian things are remembered much more than the social democrat issues you mentioned.
Well, if I understood your question, well, I think that, and correct me because I might have misunderstood it. I think that the interpretation of Smith, particularly in the US, there is, of course, as you have Glory Liu present the book. I think the interpretation has varied. I mean, she goes back to, Jefferson and Washington and comes to the, I think the Chicago interpretation took one part of Adam Smith, magnified that part significantly, and continued interpreting him the way that actually they found most convenient. And as I said before, I don't think it is wrong per se. I think it's a selective interpretation. And what I was trying to maybe accomplish or do in my book is to simply push against that interpretation and to say that another interpretation, although that too could be selective, at least is equally valid and, in my opinion, actually more valid. So I do think that there was a sort of a transformation, which of course is not surprising. You know, people interpret big authors, and I'm sure in 50 years we would interpret Adam Smith yet differently, precisely because such big authors, I think, remain with us for a long time, forever maybe.
So with the white shirt, yes.
So I was really interested in your work on inequality, and you talked a little bit about how Adam Smith saw factor incomes changing over time. How would you see inequality both globally and within countries, because I guess they are roughly the same over the long term, changing over an infinite time horizon? So would you see a kind of equilibrium where, say, everyone is different or everyone's the same? Or would you see kind of what we've seen over human history so far, which is it's constantly changing?
Well, because you will have to invite me for another talk.
Yes.
On this, yeah. But let me just say about the most current developments, because they are not exactly the way that you described them. Inequality in majority of countries over the last 30, 40 years has gone up. Not all the time, because actually most recently we see in the UK actually the decline in inequality. But if we compare today with 1980, we do actually in the US, UK, Sweden, Russia, China, South Africa, India, everywhere we see an increase. But globally, we see a decline in global inequality because of rise of China, India, Indonesia, Vietnam, and so on. So the two things, the global inequality and within national inequalities, currently go in two different directions. Because the global inequality is predominantly determined by what happens with the growth rates of relatively poor countries. And obviously, China was a very poor country 40 years ago, and it has grown tremendously. And it has, almost alone, it explains the decline in global income inequality. So just to conclude, because I think it's an important point, we have to keep in mind that the current period, and I'm talking about the period from 1980s until today, is a period of increasing within national inequalities, and at the same time decreasing global inequality because of the the importance of economic growth.
So would you say here in the UK that Smith would think it's a dull economy?
Well,
And that's
yes,
what explains
he would
the
think it's a
decline in-
dull economy. If we say that the growth rate is close to zero over 10 years overall, yes, that would be the atmospherics would be dull, but not melancholic.
Not yet. Let's hope not. So we'll go to Jeff, and Jeff here in the second row. Jeff Palmer.
Thank you very much for an interesting lecture. I was fascinated by when you start off with the term sameness. What do you mean by that? Because I don't think whether Smith then was referring to economics. I think he was referring to humanity. And if he's referring to humanity, how do you define that sameness? And also, in terms of inequality and self-interest, how then would you, therefore, when you're saying, inequality has to be justified, how would you justify that if that sameness refers to humanity?
As I said, I think I define sameness in two versions. In our ability to feel for others, which is expressed in empathy, which, as we all know, is the founding stone of the theory of moral sentiments, and our ability to understand other people's self-interest. And I think the reason why we are able to understand, to have empathy and to understand self-interest is I define it as such because of sameness, because of the things that we share. And this is our motivation, our desire, as I mentioned, quoting Smith, our desire for a betterment of our condition. These are things that we share, and consequently what we feel, what one feels, can be understood by him or her in others. So that's how I see sameness. As I said before, I was really wondering how I should call it, because it is not identity, it is not a similarity, but it's something more fundamental that I think we have, and that he believes that we have, rather. Now, let me see, how does it explain inequality? That's a jump. I agree with that. That's a jump because basically I bring in roles there and argue that we would actually accept only inequality such that was necessary to improve the condition of the war staff. That's not obviously in Smith. But I was just saying this was consistent with the view that I believe Smith entertained, and that's the view of sameness or mutual understanding between individuals.
Did it have a racial element?
I think in the on the level of humanity there is no racial element, because I think it's shared by everybody. This is my interpretation of Smith, so people may disagree with it, but I think that he fundamentally believed in what they call the sameness of people, which meant even ability to comprehend each other and to deal with each other. Because if we don't have that, then obviously the discussion is pointless. We cannot understand each other. And I don't mean only that in empathy part. I think it's important to realize that the same holds for the self-interest part. Because we can understand that you are selling me certain good, not because you love me, but because you need to make money. So I think both of them apply.
So we'll do a question over here.
I will be
And
shorter
then-
in answers.
We have time. We're okay.
So you were talking about the four kind of organizational bodies that Adam Smith would kind of put things against. Given the changes in the social landscape between then and now, with the decline of the power and influence of the church, a decline in integrity within governmental institutions over the past 10, 15, 20 years, and these kind of changes in relationships, do you think he'd pick those same four main bodies today? And do you think he would kind of still think similarly about them, or do you think he'd think quite radically differently about them given our current societal landscape?
Well, an excellent question. I haven't really thought of that. I would start with the general assumption, or based on the reading on Smith, that every association has to be looked upon with a very skeptical eye. And I think one of the features of Adam Smith, which I think many people find attractive, is that his utter reasonableness in that sense. As actually everything has to be looked with skepticism, especially when groups are being formed and groups pursue their own interests, and sometimes they try to camouflage that interest by pretending that it's, general interest. But your question is very good, because all four groups have changed in relative importance. We talked a little bit about trade unions' importance. I don't mean currently, which is on decline, but I meant like in the latter second part of the 20th century, which was really a very important association. So maybe I have to think about this question. Maybe he would have actually different level of negativism towards different groups, depending, I think, on his assessment about the likelihood of their influencing the government, about the size of the group, because when I said that he was not critical of workers, is partly because of the size. So if you're a large group and try to influence, that's better than if you're a small group. And finally, depending on their closeness to power. But however I read him, I cannot disregard that or forget that he would be very critical about associations of capitalists or employers who try to influence public policy. I just cannot see how he would not have been critical, given their current power and given also the facility of coordination which they had in the past and they have now, and the access to the government, and the revolving doors between the government and the private sector.
So we'll do you in the suit there, and then Maria behind. So two over there, and then we'll go back to Gary.
Thank you very much for your lecture. I was just wondering, as it's a very sort of popular opinion to map on The Wealth of Nations as the more right-wing work of Smith, and through your moral sentiments, the more left-wing work of Smith. But as you mentioned in your book, sort of The Wealth of Nations is actually more critical of the rich than the theory. How does that map onto what you mentioned earlier with the social democratic Smith versus libertarian Smith? Do you think it's a simplification to assign sort of left-right labels to the two works?
On the two works, I actually think it's really, in my opinion, entirely wrong. I actually think that the theory of moral sentiments is, and that I didn't talk about today, but it is in the book. I think that in the theory of moral sentiments, his attitude towards the rich, his attitude of sort of derision, he makes fun of them, their tastes and the way that they spend money are sort of laughable. But, and I think it's a very important point, he never questions their position in the hierarchy of power. He never questions the way that wealth was acquired. And when you go to the Wealth of Nations, it's an entirely different world. Actually, he goes on in great detail about collusion, monopoly, conspiracy, plunder, attack on East India Company, attack on the trading cities of Italy, attack on crusades, attack on slavery, attack on colonialism. It's absolutely a different world. And that's why I think it's a much more of a sort of a realistic picture, and much, I would say, much more left-wing than the theory of moral sentiments that I actually find simply similar to being Veblenesque in some sense, but never really questioning the authority. And let me give you one further point of which I'm proud, at least maybe other people have found it. I just simply did a search of the words God, providence, divine maker. I think there are 4 words. 200 times approximately in the theory of moral sentiments. And in the Wealth of Nations, which is 3 times as big, 6. So it is, I think, very clear what is the objective of the, as people have written, actually, David Wooten, for example, whose book I liked very much about profits and pleasure. And, it is directed to an entirely different audience. It is discussing economic things from a different angle. And I think that this division that I think Amartya Sen was largely, I think, responsible for, I honestly don't see how that can pass a critical scrutiny, to use Adam Smith's terms.
I mean, often it's simply kind of a semantic, you know, there's a laziness where people say, oh, theory of moral sentiments,
Yes,
it must be moral. And then they look at wealth of nations, and it's wealth, and wealth is bad, and moral is good. And then once you actually look at the books and you try to understand them, it's like you said with the Wealth of Nations, if you read these things, and his as we were speaking earlier, his narrative is quite easy to understand, and it's he takes you in to understand. It's almost as if he's raging sometimes when he's critiquing these.
I actually think because I read the theory of moral sentiments after Wealth of Nations much later, but I started appreciating all the things that he talks about acquisition of wealth more after theory of moral sentiments by absence in the theory of moral sentiments. So that's where I became much more aware. And as I was saying to Adam, I actually think that in some parts he's more critical of that than Marx. And the reason why I think is that in Marx's development of capitalism, however bad it is a sort of precursor of a new society. So as you know, Marxists had a problem, should they develop capitalism or not? Because only after capitalism gets developed, you can go to socialism. So the critique is also always has in Marx a certain element of inevitability and certain element of progressiveness even. Particularly when he discusses, for example, the colonial situation in India, which is very ambivalent. But in Adam Smith, when he goes after the East India Company, after the Italian trade cities, after slavery, there is no ambiguity. It's like a pure negative view of that.
Yeah. So Maria, just behind.
Hi, thank you for your lecture. And I'm just a biologist. I'm not an economist, but I see as an economist of nature in a sense. And equality for nature, it's an illusion, right? It's something that we do not see in nature. And of course that this is an aspiration, but it's almost like an illusion for us as well. We haven't seen it at play. And the way I try to understand that thinking with nature is that inequalities today are maintained. It's a highly resilient system that we have that maintain these inequalities to the point that the type of growth we have today sustain these inequalities. So what new kinds of growth do we need to see so we at least departure a little bit from the very high inequality and maybe start tipping the system to maybe an alternative stable state that I haven't seen in nature, but maybe because it's us, we can actually try to tip it in a different way?
Well, good question. You know, I have to say that, and I always have to say that when we look at, we are not speaking equality, inequality, it's not antinomic statement. We're actually seeing inequality as a continuum. So neither Adam Smith nor Marx nor anybody would actually see total equality, because it is, as you were saying, in nature it's impossible in human societies. I mean, the simplest possible way that you can see that it's impossible is think of the lifetime. You know, a person who is a student will not have an income, but he will have an income after he graduates or she graduates. So, you know, nobody really is saying that we should have, that we should all have the same income. But the question is actually what are the levels, what are the types of inequalities that are acceptable? And going back a little bit to what I was saying about the second point about Smith, is that he believed that a very large part of inequality is due to accidents. Accidents of birth, accidents of meeting somebody, what called in today's terminology episodic luck. And I think it's important to take this into view, because that actually introduces then really issues like gender, race, parental background, because they are all exogenous conditions to an individual. And these inequalities, first, are less justifiable. And secondly, I think it's important to keep them in mind, because when you see yourself and somebody who has much lower income, you cannot ascribe that to some intrinsic difference in you. And that's why I think it's important in Smith. When he sees a philosopher and a porter, he says, well, we were the same as kids, and maybe growing up. But then one had the access to education, good parents, and went all the way up, and the other did not. And I think it's very important because it establishes certain moral equivalency between us as individuals. If we believe that the observable inequality is really somehow reflective on inherent differences in people, then we have much greater difficulty of interacting or accepting each other as equal. So that's why I think that the second point that I mentioned, sameness plus the role of accidents. When I mean accidents, I mean exogenous circumstances which lead you to be the rich or poor, is important, is precisely because without a realization of that, you actually do not have the sameness either.
Gary.
Thank you very much. It's a great lecture. I really enjoyed the description of the 4 organisations. I want to go back to government, if I can, for a moment. And I don't disagree with your critique of government and the wealth of nations, but also in the theory of moral sentiments. Smith also advocated that government should be viewed in direct proportion to the extent to which they improve the kind of happiness, well-being of their citizens. Yeah. So if you kind of jump forward to the current situation just now, where would Smith be? Maybe not a status, would he be? What would be the role of government, do you think Smith would advocate in the current kind of economic situation we're in?
These are really, I mean, shifting Smith to the present obviously presents always the difficulties, because one has to jump over, actually extrapolate from what he writes. Because when he's, he has 4 functions of government, and if you put these numbers together, these 4 functions would probably have 10% of GDP. So that a literal reading of Smith would tell you that would be the functions that, you know, the protection of property, protection against external invasion, basically juristic function of the government, and elementary public education. But if you extrapolate, as we were saying before, I think that Smith would actually accept many other functions of the government which came along. But obviously we don't have a textual confirmation of that because the role of the government then was much smaller. And if we look at these 4 functions, they were overall, as I think, actually 10% of GDP, and nowadays government are 30, 40%. So that's part of the extrapolation in which I think we have to start, like the other ones, with what we believe are some fundamental principles that Smith, we believe, holds. And when I was saying before, if we believe that the fundamental principle is the welfare of majority, then I think Smith would actually see every policy that would improve the welfare of majority people as desirable. And on those days, as you know, that was actually a very unusual stand, because for mercantilist point of view, that didn't play any role, because majority of people were at a subsistence. What really mattered is for the state to be powerful and the king to be powerful. But who cared about the rest of, well, nobody really paid any attention, because they were by definition at a subsistence. And I have to say, I have to give it to Kenne, because he brings up the before Smith, or actually around the same time, he brings up really the welfare of the majority as the focus of government policy. And then Smith continues, or might have defined, I don't know exactly the years, but it was about the same time.
Do we have any? John. Wait for the microphone, John.
Can I make 2 related points? One of which Otto Curtis very forcefully in Panmure House is to say, when Smith wrote, there was no electricity here, there was no running water here. To go right, we call it Loch End Close because it ran down to the cesspit, which was what in Edinburgh we now call Princess Street Gardens. It seems to me to ask, what would Smith have thought about internet regulation or the National Health Service? Is just really not very helpful. That doesn't mean we shouldn't admire Smith, and we particularly should try and replicate his interdisciplinary approach as you described at the beginning, but not ask what would Smith be voting in the UK or US elections this year. And then I want to ask, what would have been the phenomena that would have been important to look at? Let's try to think what we think about Facebook or Amazon or something in relation to this kind of interdisciplinary thought. And the point which I want to make is that the main source of these companies' profits and the impact they have on the distribution of income is not to do with returns on capital. It's to do with economic rents that used to be earned from differential fertility of land and now arise from differential effectiveness of corporations. And I would like to think that if someone with Smith's abilities were looking at the world today, he would be thinking in terms of those terms and understanding what the sources of this differentiation are. It's a very different world in terms of the theory of rent and rent generation than it was 250 years ago. But that's still an even more powerful tool today to thinking about the distribution of income, wealth, and the way in which our economies function.
Let me break this into 2, oh, you actually did it, in 2 parts. The second part about the rent, actually that was essentially what we talked about. It's the relative power and, yes, the rent actually, because this is the rent which oftentimes comes from introduction of a new product and ability to basically corner the market or to have the monopoly. So I think we would agree on that. On the first part, I'm not so sure that we should really say that these thinkers have nothing or very little to say, because Yes, of course, the conditions have changed. You know, there is electricity, there is sewage. We are much richer now than people similar to us were 250 years ago. But if we go by the essential principles that we believe are leading these thinkers, and I don't mean only Smith, I actually mean Marx as well, we can first interpret that and then extrapolate reasonably to what they would think. I'm not saying we can extrapolate with 100%, and I was actually very sort of agnostic on the question that was asked, what would be the position about these four groups? You know, organized church has become much less important. It's true, he would not have paid that much attention. But I do think that actually if we believe there are certain principles that guided their thinking, we are justified in reasonably extrapolating to the present. Because if we don't extrapolate to the present, then one wonders, like, why do we need them at all? After all, the world has not started yesterday. It has been around for a long time.
Just behind you, Louisa, there's a question.
Hi, can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
You are speaking to a Western audience, but if you go to speak with like China or other more state-controlled, economy, would your message about Adam Smith be the same, or how did you do another version of it?
Well, I didn't speak of this book in China in December. I was there the whole month. But I did give it to several people. No, my message would be the same. I would not change the message at all. Now, it could be, as we're saying going back to the principles, it could be that the same message, that the interpretation of that critical attitude towards four groups would change, interpretation would change depending on which of the four groups is very important. For example, if you were to take this principle that I said before, that Adam Smith is more critical of the groups that are more exclusivist and push their own interests, if I were to give the same speech in Iran, maybe people would say really what he would have been critical would be the religion, organized religion. But that does not, in my opinion, mean that Smith's principles are wrong. It's just that in different contexts, maybe in the case of China, the role of the state is the most determinant, very important, and maybe the Smith would actually then focus specially on that role. But I think that the principle of treating each organization skeptically would be valid throughout.
So we have Jeff.
But my speech would not change just simply because I've changed the audience.
Jeff, did you want to ask another question?
I would just out of interest, I found that with a lot of this history, the time in which things are done is critical.
Sure.
And therefore, if you have the theory of modern moral sentiment and you have the Wealth of Nation, one is 1759, the other is 1776, I think. 1759, you've got David Hume saying people are inferior. There was no sameness there. And therefore, what I'm asking is that, are those two books influenced by the time?
I totally think that they're influenced by the time and the place. And every book was actually influenced by the time and the place. But as I said, I don't think that means that they are not applicable elsewhere. I think they're very applicable, as I was just saying in response to the last question. But this is, of course, individual thinking. I even think that in Adam Smith's life, the theory of moral sentiments was written, okay, let me put it maybe too bluntly. I think it was what you call today a job market paper. I think it was written when he got his position, when he had to show that he handles the matter well, that he was to write a somewhat critical book within the legitimate framework, which included, of course, not direct criticism of religion or atheistic views. So I think that within that context, when you were saying context of the time, I see this as reflecting the Adam Smith then. But I see the Wealth of Nations, and I know that actually he continued working on both simultaneously, so it's not, I'm not talking about two different Adam Smiths, but I just see that as a more mature, free to say whatever he wants. And I think I quoted in my book or here a very beautiful quote from Neeraj Chaudhary in a different context. A certain, I think Chaudhary calls it exuberant despair. Because there is a certain element of despair in the Wealth of Nations that it's hard to fix things. But on the other hand, there is sort of a feeling of freedom to say it. And that's obviously interpretation. And I think that that freedom was not, or maybe the age was element, was not there in the theory of moral sentiments.
I mean, so when he lived here, he added a third to the theory of moral sentiments.
Yes.
And when he came to write the theory, so when he came to write the Wealth of Nations, he was no longer an academic, right? So I mean, he had the lectures on the ideas were returning, but the actual writing of it was after he left the university. Now, I'm not saying we should. I like being an academic, but there is something to be said about that the freedom to say, and there's so many conventions that frame and shape academic knowledge creation, which I think often constrains what people really want to say.
Yes.
But that's why we have places
And,
like
and what
Canberra
I
House.
think that constraint is actually very evident now. I think we are now having more, unfortunately, of that constraint that we had 10 years ago.
Yes.
So I actually see that constraint, as I call it, job market paper, is that you have a certain feature. I have yet to see a job market paper which does not even follow the structure which is given. And when you're young and you're not going to be brave enough to break the structure. But at a more mature age, and with large, as we talk today, with lots of income, the constraints are much weaker.
But we should still encourage
Young
early
people,
career
yes.
scholars to say what they believe in, and that's a big problem. But on that note, please let's give Branko a round of applause.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And so thank you so much for coming. We have drinks and canapes downstairs, and you can buy Branko's book if you're interested, which is very well written. He'll sign it for you. Will you sign books?
Well, sign it.
He'll sign books. And I'm sure you could try to corner him to ask him what he really thinks. Thank you so much, and have a good evening.
Thank you very much. Thank you.